morning, church. Kids, you are dismissed to children's church at this time. The rest of you, I ask that you turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 24. We had a moment of panic. I didn't know where the clicker was, and it wasn't back there, and we had no idea. Evidently, I've had one of those mornings where I've forgotten everything I've done so far, and I've already put it up here, so we're good to go this morning. Last week we started in on this chapter, Genesis chapter 24, and we discovered that the big undertones of this chapter involve God's sovereignty and man's surrender. And I would argue that last week we looked at God's sovereignty. And the mission became finding a wife for Isaac. That's what we needed. Because through Isaac shall all of Abraham's offspring be named. God has said that again and again and again. And we saw last week that Abraham connected the success of this mission to go find a wife for Isaac to the, I don't know what my daughter's doing. Just running around here. To the work of a sovereign God. And we saw last week that Abraham rested in that idea. So that's sort of the setup for the rest of this chapter. We see God's sovereignty on a macro level, bigger picture, and it's going to be accomplished. And then today we're going to see kind of how that begins to play out. We're going to see some of the details, God working in some of the behind-the-scenes details. We're going to look more on a micro level of God's sovereignty. Now, last week we defined God's sovereignty in this way. It is God's authority, it is God's control, it is God's presence in all things. And that definition stands for today's message as well, but we're really going to emphasize that last part, in all things. In all things. Now, there's this study of science called the chaos theory. Maybe you've heard of the chaos theory before. They call it the science of surprises. According to the chaos theory, there is a measure of chaos, a measure of disorder in all of nature. It can be found in nearly anything, and it's completely unpredictable. Completely unpredictable. While most traditional science deals with supposedly predictable things like gravity and electricity and chemical reactions and things like that, chaos theory deals with the non-linear things that are effectively impossible to predict or to control. And there are so many, really what the idea behind it is that there are so many tiny, minute little variables that will end up having major effects. And a popular part of the chaos theory is called the butterfly effect. There are lots of things that we could talk about with the butterfly effect, but one of the main things when it comes to the butterfly effect is it says that a butterfly that flapped its wings 4,000 years ago over in China may have caused a hurricane today in Florida. Right? That's an idea. That's an idea. If the butterfly had not flapped its wings at just the right moment in time and space, that hurricane never would have taken place. Chaos theory says that small changes in the initial conditions lead to drastic changes in the result. And I want you to remember that. Hold on to that, all right? It tries to explain the apparent randomness that is built into this universe, the things that science cannot measure and predict. Now, the University of Tokyo they performed a study on falling paper, of all things. They took a piece of paper, and you hold it out, you meet a certain condition, you hold that piece of paper out, and they say that you cannot possibly predict precisely where this piece of paper is going to land. The world's greatest supercomputers, China's quantum computer, cannot possibly predict where that piece of paper is going to land, right? But then they say, that's fine, we don't know that, but you could take a piece of paper that's the exact same size, exact same weight, everything, all the same conditions, hold it to the same height, drop it again, and they say it will not land in the same place. It is completely unpredictable. All the same criteria have been met with a different result. A different result. It's chaos, it's unpredictable, and because of this, scientists say that's a part of our lives. Our lives then must be defined in some measure by this unpredictability, this chaos that is ingrained in our lives. But modern science, we know, cannot take God into account. Modern science can't take God into account. No supercomputer can measure God's sovereign governance over all things. God's sovereign control is complete. To say that God's sovereign control is only partial is to have a very poor and finite view of who God is. His control is complete. Every aspect of nature and history and life falls within God's sovereign governance. All of life and everything that happens has a personal guide to lead it to a very particular outcome. So there's our big idea this morning. This is what we're going to say, is that God arranges all of life to accomplish His good will. He arranges everything in life to eventually accomplish His good will. And I'm excited for us to see that in the text this morning from Genesis chapter 24. And I will let you know that this is the longest chapter in the entire book of Genesis. It is 67 verses. We covered 9 last week in about a 45-minute span, right? I could sit here and do this the way I normally do it, cover each verse, but we're going to be here for 2 hours if I give just 2 minutes to each verse. So we're going to do this a little bit differently this morning. I'm going to compare this sermon to a rather aggressive flight. And I know that's a little, we look at the news today, and I want you to know you will survive this flight, okay? But we're going to take off. We're going to fly at 500 miles per hour through the long distance of this text, and then at the end we're going to come in for a crash landing. Basically, there's not going to be a whole lot of time for application by the time we get all the way through this chapter. But we're going to we get to look at this from 30,000 feet in the air. All right, that's how we're going to do this, because I think that is going to show us who the main character really is in this chapter. I've been studying this passage for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and I just kept thinking that this unnamed servant that we see is the main character. He's not the main person of this passage, not at all. There's a reason I think that he goes unnamed in this chapter. I think we could probably know who he is. I think we could take a pretty good guess and look back at chapter 15 and say that this servant is probably Eliezer. But Moses doesn't want to give him a name here. He's not given a name in this chapter, I think, because he's not the person that we should focus on. The focus today is very much on God. He is the main character of the story who's driving the work of His promises forward. God is working in the details throughout this entire story. So that's how we're going to approach the chapter this morning, categorizing the work of God into basically 4 main sections. And we'll get into it here because I'm a little bit limited on time. The first thing that we're going to see from God, that I want us to see from God in this text, is that, 1, God blessed Abraham. That is a sovereign work of God. God blessed Abraham. We saw that this was a promise all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. God told Abraham, I will bless you and I will make your name great. And then in the opening of Genesis chapter 24, that very first verse tells us the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And we're now going to see how that blessing plays out in this mission throughout this chapter. We look at verse 10. That's really where we're going to start this morning. After swearing to Abraham that he would go search for a wife for Isaac, the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from his master. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. So we see there, emphasized for your benefit, areas in which we see that Abraham has been blessed by God. And then we see, we're not going to take this passage, by the way, in a linear fashion. I'm going to be all over the place. We go to verses 35 and 36, and we see something similar. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, is what the servant says. And he has become great. There's a direct answer to God's promise in Genesis 12. He has blessed my master and has become great. God has given him flocks and herds and silver and gold and male and female servants and camels and donkeys. Right? Notice that the servant says, God blessed Abraham with this and this and this. God gave him this and this and this. And we can see that throughout Abraham's entire narrative. We go back, we can look at all the many years and the many experiences that he's had, specifically go back to chapter 12, go back to chapter 14, go back to chapter 20, and we're going to see how God has sovereignly provided all of these things for Abraham. Go back and read those accounts sometime this week. But verse 10 makes a very specific mention of camels. I just want to focus in on that for a second. Camels were a status symbol back then. They weren't so much for utility as they were luxury. Camels were the Rolls Royce of the ancient Eastern world. It's kings had camels. It wasn't just a rich guy that would have a camel or two. Kings had camels. And to have 10 of them show up, imagine what the people in Mesopotamia were probably thinking. It's like it would be like if we had this incredible motorcade go down Central in Esterville, and we're all going to be wondering, who is that? Who is in town? Is the president in town? What is this type of thing, right? It grabs attention. 10 camels waltzing into a town is going to grab some attention. So I think that the camels are meant to be a bit of a flex. The servant is showing that he represents a very, very wealthy man, a very blessed man. There's a little bit of flaunting of great blessing going on here, but I'm going to say that they serve a couple other purposes too, and we're going to see that. We'll see how they pull double duty. Not only are the camels going to be a flex of great wealth, a show of great wealth to these people, these camels are going to provide a test of great character for Rebekah later on in the story. And I'll let that lead me into this next point. So we have the fact that God blessed Abraham, provided for him all throughout these many, many decades. Now we're going to see that God directed Abraham's servant. We see in the text that Abraham's servant went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. Nahor is Abraham's brother. That's who that is. If you remember at the end of Genesis chapter 22, Abraham received this information that his brother Nahor has been greatly blessed with many family members, a sizable family, and Abraham's servant is there to find that family. So let me say this, as we get into it, as we get into the servant's journey, I would suggest that God's guidance for Abraham's servant came first by way of wisdom. I think we see a whole lot of wisdom in this unnamed servant throughout this story. Proverbs 2:6 says, "For the Lord gives wisdom." It comes from him. And Abraham's servant, I think, just emanates the wisdom of God as he enters the city. We look at verse 11. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. So we'll stop right there for a second. This is not circumstantial. This is deliberately planned. I want us to see that. The servant arrived to town and went to the local well in the evening. Maybe because he did just get off of a 500-mile journey. We know that he's probably thirsty, but notice what the text says. That's where the women are going to be. He goes to the well because that's where the women are going to be. The well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. In the ancient Eastern world, it was customary for women, particularly unmarried women, available women, eligible bachelorettes, to be responsible for drawing water from the well. Before there was eHarmony and Christian Mingle, it was the well. That's where they go, right? That's where they know. That's where men know they're going to find a single woman. And since that was the servant's mission, that's where he goes. Finding the right person requires that you go to the right place. So part one of the plan, locate the well. Part two of the plan, position the camels. They aren't just a flex of wealth. Remember that they're going to help administer a very shrewd character test. I'm not convinced that this necessarily models the prerequisites that Abraham gave to the servant, but the servant, I think, wants to know that whatever woman he finds that he's going to bring back or attempt to bring back for Isaac is going to be the right woman for Isaac. There's going to be chemistry there. She's going to be the right fit, shared values, things of that nature. So, for a family, Abraham's family, that has been really well characterized throughout Scripture, for us to see that they're clearly hospitable, clearly a hardworking people, I think that the servant wants to find a hospitable, hardworking woman to come back and be a part of that family. And we'll see that these camels are going to help find her. So the servant locates the well. He positions the camels. Third step of the plan, I think, is probably where we see the most wisdom out of the servant. He prays to God. He has everything set up, and then he prays. He says, "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, 'Please let down your jar that I may drink,' and who shall say, 'Drink, and I will water your camels,' let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac." So there's the plan. It's kind of laid out for us now. A woman who will get him and get all of the camels water, all 10 of the camels. So I want us to notice here that the servant's plan requires God's personal and intimate involvement. I want us to see this. God has to be personally and intimately involved in this, because notice twice the servant gives himself over to the sovereignty of God in this prayer. First, he says, "Please grant me success." And the Hebrew word for that literally means, "Lord, make it happen in front of me. Make it happen in front of me." It refers specifically to God's divine orchestration. It requires God's personal and intimate involvement in these things, working events out according to His will and taking happenstance and coincidence and fate and luck and kismet and whatever else people believe in out of the equation completely. It's the perfect example, I think, of Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in the mind of man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that shall stand. The servant can do everything right. The plan can be a good plan. Everything can go well, but it's God that is going to make something happen here. I love what J.I. Packer says in regard to this. He says, "Believers are never in the grip of blind forces like fortune and chance and luck and fate. All that happens to them is divinely planned, and each event comes as a new summons to trust, obey, and rejoice." And we'll see that in the text. But if his plan is going to work, it's because the Lord has ordained it to work. Please grant me success today. Lord, you control the results, is what he's saying. And then at the end of the prayer, he says, "And let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac." Whom you, God, have appointed for Isaac. Abraham's servant rightly recognizes that God has already picked out a bride for this man. All the servant needs to know now is which woman this is going to be. And the sign is going to be in relation to what she does for him. Is she going to give him water and then also all of the camels' water? And look at this. Before the servant had even finished his prayer, something happens. God answered the servant's prayer. I love it. The text makes clear that before he was done speaking, God answered his prayer. He says, Moses writes this, before he had finished speaking, "Behold, Rebekah." As he's praying for this woman appears. As Moses writes this story for us, he gives a very clear indication to us, to his immediate audience, that Rebekah is exactly who the Lord has appointed for Isaac. The servant doesn't know that yet at this point in the story, but you and I are to know this. She meets the requirements plus some. All right, the text tells us that she's from the right family. Behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother. And I'd make an argument that Rebekah is about as of the family, of the kindred of Abraham as possible, because in her father, Bethuel, both of Abraham's brothers' lines come together, right? And she is the daughter of that man. She's of the right family, that's clear. She's from the right location. She's at the well ready to get some water, so that is a sign to us that she's likely available. She's unmarried. And let's see what else. The young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. So that's great. She's good looking. That wasn't even something that Abraham said had to be. It's just, that's a bonus, right? She's good looking. She's maintained her purity. That's important. But then we get to the sign that Abraham's servant asks for. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water to drink from your jar." She said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water, and she drew for all his camels. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. She gave the servant water, and just as he had hoped, she offered to draw water for all of the camels as well, suggesting to the servant that this may be the right woman for Isaac. She passes the character test. And just as an aside, I want you to know what Rebekah went through in order to pass this test. All right? She watered all the camels. We need to understand that in the ancient world, the well that they would go down to, it wasn't just how we picture a well, some brick and a bucket that you let down. It was a great big hole in the earth that she had to walk down. There were steps down to it. She would have to go down to the spring and then come back up with a full jar. And it takes some amount of effort to do that, right? But once more, though these camels, I was looking this up this week, camels can actually drink 53 gallons of water each in a matter of 3 minutes. That's incredible. And we could assume that these camels are probably thirsty. They just went on a 500-mile journey. But I'll concede and say that typically a camel will drink somewhere between 25 and 30 gallons of water in just one sitting. An ancient water jar, like what Rebekah would have had, will hold somewhere around 3 gallons of water. There were 10 camels. 10 camels. So we'll just conservatively estimate that there was somewhere between 250 and 300 gallons of water that she would have to draw to water all of these camels. She drew for all his camels, and the language implies that they drank their fill after a 500-mile journey. When the camels had finished drinking, she watered them until they were finished. Now we do the math, and we see that Rebekah would have had to make anywhere between 80 to 100 trips down to the well and back up with a full jar. And that would probably take a few hours for her to do that. All the while, the servant watched without saying a word to see whether or not the Lord had made this journey successful. Hardworking and hospitable, I think, are probably understatements for this woman, right? That's what I would say. And the servant pays her. He does pay her. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels. In today's dollars, that's around $12,000 that he pays her. That's worth it. I'd go draw water for $12,000. But I'm sure she also wasn't expecting that. But it's another show that God has greatly blessed Abraham. And then the servant had her confirm her identity and asked if there was room at her father's house for him to stay. And she said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." And then she added, "We have plenty of both straw and fodder and room to spend the night." So now he knows. Now the servant knows this is the woman that he is looking for. It's all been confirmed for him. There's no question that this is the woman that he has been sent to find, the one whom God had appointed for Isaac. God has answered the servant's prayers here, and he has orchestrated things all the way down to a T. So Abraham's servant, what does he do next? That's what we have to, this is great. In light of everything that has happened so far, he bowed down and worshiped to God right there in public before everyone, before the woman and everyone. The man bowed his head and worshiped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. And as for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman." Abraham's servant glorified God for his steadfast love and his faithfulness to Abraham. And that's a recurring theme in this chapter. I know we didn't step back and read through the entire chapter all in once, but we'll see where the servant talks about a steadfast love and a faithfulness to Abraham from God probably 3 or 4 times throughout this little narrative. The Hebrew word denotes both truth and reliability when we talk of God's faithfulness toward Abraham. God has shown himself to be true and reliable to his word, even in a needle in a haystack situation like what we have here. So the servant takes God's faithfulness and he turns it into worship. He glorifies God for what God has obviously done in this. And I want to tell you something. This is kind of a side point, but this is important. God is glorified when he is trusted as true and reliable, when we trust in his faithfulness. And that needs to connect to our hearts this morning. We exist, let's back up here. We exist for the glory of God. If you're familiar with the Westminster Shorter Catechism, the chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. We are in this world for the purpose of God's glory. We look at the opening sentence to our own church mission statement. I think it might even be in the bulletin. I'm not sure anymore. But Grandview Baptist Church exists for the sole purpose of glorifying God through Christ. And there are many outward ways that we are called to glorify God, called to express this, evangelizing the community, edifying his people, exalting God in our corporate worship. But we glorify God on a very personal level from the inside, first and foremost, when we trust him. Trusting God is what we do because of the faith that we've been given. Trust and faith are not the same thing. Trust is something that we have to do. It's an action that's called of us. Proverbs 3:5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart." That the Bible puts the onus on us to do that we would put our trust in him. God's very nature, though, is faithful and it is true, and he shows that his plans are both perfect and they are purposeful and they are worthy of our trust. And it inspires the servant to worship. You know, last week we saw kind of the main idea of those first 9 verses in chapter 24. We learned from Abraham that God's sovereignty ought to inspire believers to embrace his plan, to join in on that plan. This week we can learn from the servant that God's sovereignty ought to inspire believers to worship and praise our God as we look and we marvel at what it is that he is doing in this world and in our lives. All right, we got to race through the rest of this chapter. I'm about a little over halfway done with the sermon. We're not even halfway through the text here. So we're going to race through the rest of this. Verses 29 through 33 introduce us to Rebekah's brother, Laban, who has some say in Rebekah's betrothal and marriage. Laban is going to be a fairly important person that comes up again in the narrative, I think even more specifically when we start looking at Jacob's story. So we're going to wait to cover who Laban is until we get to that point, but I will tell you that in this introduction, I think that we are to get the sense that he has an eye for material things, and he's perhaps a fairly greedy and duplicitous man. And we know that or we can assume that, let me put it that way, because that we see in the text, as soon as Laban saw the jewelry that Rebekah was given, that ring and those bracelets, and upon hearing about the luxurious camels that the servant brought in, then Laban ran out to go meet Abraham's servant. And verses 34 through 48, then, are a complete retelling of everything that has happened so far. Abraham's servant went to Rebekah and Laban's house, and he told Laban and Rebekah's father, Bethuel, the entire story. Throughout his retelling of the story, the servant makes sure to emphasize points of God's sovereign authority and his control throughout the events that have played out. And so here's what I'm going to say. Abraham's servant emphasized the sovereign work of an almighty God. This is very important. This is what the servant wants to stand out to Laban and to Bethuel, that that there is a sovereign God, an almighty God at work in everything that has happened. And we see that as he retells the story. He talks about an angel that's being sent to prosper the way. In verse 42, we see that the servant prayed. He tells them, I prayed, O Lord, if now you are prospering the way that I go. So he's talking about God being in control of this. And then in verse 48, he says, then I bowed my head and worshiped the Lord who had led me by the right way. The servant invokes the authority of God and God's faithfulness to Abraham throughout his retelling of everything that has happened. And then he says to Laban and Bethuel, the two people who are in charge of giving Rebekah away in marriage, down in verse 49, he says, now then, if you are going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me that I may turn to the right hand or to the left. And I want you to understand the wisdom of the servant in this. I want you to understand what he just did. He basically has told them that God has orchestrated every last detail of his journey. God has set his aim on the success of this mission, that God is going to be faithful to Abraham to find a wife for Isaac, and that this is directly tied to the promises that God has made. He's saying that God doesn't fail. He hasn't failed yet. He's not going to fail. He has a plan. He has made these promises. So then, you can act in accordance with the almighty, powerful, sovereign God who has prospered my way to Rebekah and has led me directly to her, right? You can join God in this work, in this faithfulness and steadfast love to my master, or you can act against God and oppose his plan. What's it going to be? That's basically what the servant is stating to Bethuel and Laban. And their answer, I think after it's put that way, I think their answer is pretty good. The thing has come from the Lord, is what they say. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. In other words, where God has clearly spoken in the orchestration of these events, there isn't really a whole lot of room for human input. Right? It's not going to matter much. What these guys, what are they really going to say? What are they really going to say against a sovereign, almighty God? It will be as the Lord has spoken. But we do see a little bit of backpedaling start to happen in verses 54 through 57. Laban and Rebekah's mother delay the plan. They want Rebekah to stay another 10 days, and then she can go. And just so you know, 10 days, when we see that in Hebrew, it probably isn't a literal 10 days. That is a Hebrew idiom for an indefinite amount of time. It could be a year. It could be 100 years. There is really no specific time that's given in this. That is just an idiom. So, once again, the servant uses the authority and control and the power of God. And he basically says, do not delay me. Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Right? Do not get in God's way on this one. Send me away that I may go to my master. And so they say, okay, we're not in agreement on this. Let's leave this up to Rebekah. Let's just see what Rebekah wants to do, which is good anyway, right? That's a good thing to do. Let's see what the woman in question wants. And Rebekah says, I will go. That's all she says. I will go. And this is pivotal. This is the answer to that big concern that was on the servant's mind that was plaguing this journey. What if the woman doesn't want to follow me back and come and marry Isaac? And now we see it's a non-issue. She said, I will go. It's the final sign that this is, in fact, the right woman. This is the woman that he is to be looking for. Last week, we saw from this chapter that Abraham thinks back on the work of God. He thinks back on what God has done in his life. He draws our attention to how God called Abraham. He called Abraham out of that very same land, away from the very same family, into the very same promised land to receive the very same promises. And Abraham followed God. Genesis 12:4 says, and Abraham went. And Abraham went. And in Genesis 24:7, Abraham says the same God is going to call Isaac's wife from the same land and the same family to this land to inherit the promises of God. And that woman is Rebekah, and she says, I will go. Her "I will go" is reminiscent of Genesis 12's Abraham went. She chooses to act in faith and follow. And in that sense, what we should see is that Rebekah is depicted as a new Abraham. The language of this chapter, compared with the language in previous chapters, connects Abraham and Rebekah in this way, that they would leave their country and their kindred in faith. And remember that Abraham pointed toward God sending an angel ahead of the servant to make sure that this is all going to happen. Don't think that I forgot about that. I set a deadline. Everybody, hey, read chapter 24 and tell me where this angel comes up. And Lance said I'd give you $100. I think now, since nobody did it, you all owe me $1. And that'll make up roughly $150, and I'll be happy. But that's what Abraham says. He says, I will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But we see no mention of this angel all throughout the rest of Genesis chapter 24. He's not there. So we ask, did that actually happen? Is Abraham a liar? Is he misinformed? Was he just guessing? I don't know. I challenge y'all, and I'll tell you it is there. It's tricky, it's little, but I think the evidence that the angel showed up is actually in the text. We look at Rebekah's family and what they said to her as she departed. Look at verse 60. They said, our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him. Now, where did this family get those words? That's what comes to my mind. What does that sound like? That sounds an awful lot like, pieces of promises that have been made to Abraham from God, oftentimes with an angel speaking. But go back to Genesis 22:17. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. So that's thousands and 10,000s. But this is the part that gets me. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. The angel of the Lord said those words to Abraham years before this. And now we see that Rebekah's family is saying those same words. That was not a common phrase, just so you know. That is not something common to say. It's awfully similar, isn't it? And I think that there's absolutely no way that that's coincidental. That's just not coincidental. I think that just as Abraham said, this family had a little visitor from the angel of the Lord, a little visit from the angel of the Lord, and that angel spoke those words, the very same words that were spoken to Abraham years before this. I just cannot believe that this was coincidental. Chaos theory can't possibly explain that. In fact, we shouldn't be able to believe that any of this chapter, all the things that happen here, we shouldn't be able to believe that any of it's coincidental. Listen to me, from the beginning to the end of this chapter, if you can't look and see and admit that God has authority and control and a presence in all things, even in the smallest details, then you would have to be convinced that this chapter is filled with an unreasonable amount of coincidences. It's crazy, the amount of chaos that just happened to work out the way that God maybe hoped it would work out. No, that's not it. You would have to convince me that Abraham's servant is an heir of just straight dumb luck. And he's not. I don't think that can be. There is no chaos in this account. This was not unpredictable to the God who ordained it all. None of this comes as a surprise to him. I agree with J.I. Packer. Believers are never in the grip of blind forces. All that happens to us is divinely planned. I believe, and I think that we together are to believe, that God orchestrated every bit of this story to accomplish his good will. And that's exactly what happens. God fulfilled his good will. The Apostle Paul reminds us that God works all things according to the counsel of his will. All things is not a limiting statement. All things according to the counsel of his will. Verses 61 through 67 are an example of that truth. Rebekah went with the servant, made her way to Isaac, and Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Exactly what God ordained is exactly what happened. Rebekah came to marry Isaac. And it was all for a larger purpose than simply the comfort of Isaac after Sarah's death. Look closely one last time this morning. Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah. That's another strange statement that should stick out to us in the passage. And I think here's what it tells us. Similarly to how Rebekah is the new Abraham as she journeyed in faith to the promised land, Rebekah is to be depicted as the new Sarah as well. She is the woman through whom God's people are going to be brought into existence. God wasn't just seeking out a wife for Isaac. He was effectually calling a new matriarch of the faith, the woman through whom the seed promise would be preserved. This really isn't about Isaac anymore, is it? This is about salvation. This is about salvation. I want us to see this from God's perspective. Without this event, there could be no promised line. No promised line means no Jesus. No Jesus means no rescue for sinners. This isn't just about Isaac. It's about God's plan for his people throughout the ages. It's about God's plan for you and for me too. God's great plan of redemption, his plan to save sinners through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ, his perfect Son. The biggest event in human history where God became flesh and dwelt among us and died for us, that if we would believe in him, we would have life everlasting. That's what all this is leading to. It's crazy to think that all of that, all of our salvation, in a way, rested on this small matter of who a man in the Middle East would marry 4,000 years ago. Like a butterfly flapping its wings in China and stirring something up in Florida, right? A smaller matter reaching a magnanimous result. And yet we know that God did not leave things to chance. He took care of it all, every last detail. And church, that's the chapter. We have flown through this whole chapter at 500 miles per hour. Now we're coming in for the crash landing, so brace yourselves. I would say that more than action, more than marching orders in this chapter, I think chapter 24 inspires reflection and adoration. This chapter challenges us to look back at our own lives and see God in the details in our own stories. I'm not saying that we have stories that match the magnitude of Rebekah or the servant or Isaac or any of those people. We're not them, but we each have a story. And in the complex inner workings of our lives, God has been there and God is right now there. Whether it's in the regular provision of our necessities or seeing us through difficult times. I love this saying that they say, don't waste a trial. Right? If you're trying to get through a hard time in your life and you're not thinking about how God is working in that time, what he is doing, then you are wasting that trial. Don't waste your trials. Right? We see God working through difficult times or stories of healing or bringing us into a certain network of people or bringing us into a certain partnership with someone, a union with someone, or taking us places that we never expected to go and making us salt and light in those places that he has taken us. Church, if you're a believer in this room, you have a story in which you know that God has worked in the details of your life, in the highs and lows, in every part of it. And we can even zoom out from our own lives and we can look at this world. You can flip on the news and think all is lost. That's fine. But I'll tell you that we can know that God is intimately involved in what's going on, and we are to trust that he is working out all things according to his divine will for the fulfillment of his plan. We can trust that. And when we do this, and I'm calling you to do it this week, I'm calling you to reflect. When we spend time to reflect on the sovereignty of God and his authority and his control in the events of our own lives, in your own life, even when it seems like it's just been nothing but chaos theory, remember the response of the servant. Be inspired. Be watchful, be inspired to worship God. And I want to read something to you as I close here. This comes from an article that I read this week. Let me end with a statement and a question. The statement is that human beings are responsible, accountable, praiseworthy, and blameworthy for what they do. God's sovereignty does not diminish human accountability. That's the statement. The question is, which world would you rather live in? One where humans or Satan or chance govern what happens to us? Or one where an infinitely good, infinitely wise, and infinitely powerful God works everything together for the good of those who trust in him and for his glory? Look at the God who is. Recognize what he has done and the good that his work is going to lead to, and glorify him. Amen, church?